These symbolic structures are not just history. They hold unimaginable, terrifying secrets. Hash the bone tree. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been studying predator-prey dynamics in the Serengeti for 6 years, but she'd never seen anything like the clearing she discovered on the morning of October 12th. It was roughly circular, perhaps 30 meters across, and completely devoid of grass. The earth was hard-packed and gray, like ash that had been compressed under tremendous weight. And in its exact center stood what the Maasai guide, Kimani, called the bone tree. It wasn't immediately obvious why it had that name. From a distance, it looked like an acacia, the flat-topped trees that dotted the Serengeti landscape. But as Sarah approached, her camera equipment heavy on her shoulders, she realized the structure was wrong. The trunk was too smooth, too white, the branches too perfectly symmetrical. And when the morning sun hit it at the right angle, she saw what Kimani had seen. It was made of bones. Thousands of them, fused together in a grotesque parody of a living tree. Femurs formed the trunk, smaller bones the branches, vertebrae spiraling upward like bark. Skulls, hundreds of them from dozens of species, clustered at the joints where branches met trunk. Lion skulls, zebra skulls, wildebeest, gazelle, and others Sarah couldn't immediately identify. All bleached white by sun and time, all arranged with an artistry that made her stomach lurch. "We should go back," Kimani said quietly. He stood at the edge of the clearing, refusing to take another step forward. "This place is forbidden. The elders say it has always been here, say it was here before the first Maasai came to these lands." "That's impossible," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Bones would decompose, weather would scatter them. This structure shouldn't be able to stand." "Yet it does." Kimani's hand rested on the hilt of the short sword at his belt. "Dr. Mitchell, please, there are stories about this place. Bad stories. People who camp near here don't wake up. Animals avoid it, you notice? No tracks, no droppings, no signs of life. Even the insects stay away." Now that he mentioned it, Sarah did notice. The clearing was absolutely silent. In the Serengeti, silence was rare. There was always something moving, chirping, rustling. But here, nothing. As if the bone tree existed in a bubble of absolute stillness. Professional curiosity warred with instinct in Sarah's mind. This was unprecedented. A structure made entirely of bones, standing in the middle of one of Earth's most studied ecosystems, apparently unknown to science. If she could document it, photograph it, maybe even carbon date the bones. "Just let me take some pictures," she said. 15 minutes, then we'll go." Kimani's expression made clear what he thought of that idea, but he nodded reluctantly. 15 minutes, not 1 second more. Sarah approached the bone tree with her camera raised. Through the viewfinder, it looked even more impossible. The bones fit together with engineered precision, no mortar or binding visible, yet the structure stood firm despite wind and weather that should have toppled it decades ago. She circled it slowly, photographing from every angle, zooming in on the joints where bones met, capturing the details of individual skulls. Some of them looked ancient, weathered to the point of fragility. Others seemed newer, almost fresh, which made no sense. How could new bones be added to a structure that Kimani claimed had always been here? As she completed her circuit, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. On the ground at the tree's base, partially hidden by the trunk, was a human's skull. Not ancient, not weathered. The bone was still faintly yellow, still had traces of tissue in the crevices. This person had died recently, within the last year, Sarah estimated, and they died here at the base of the bone tree. "Kimani," she called out, "there's a human skull here. We need to report this to." The words died in her throat as she looked up at the guide. He was staring past her, his face drained of color, his hand now gripping his sword so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "It's moving," he whispered. Sarah spun around. The bone tree was exactly as she'd left it, white still, a grotesque sculpture under the African sun. But as she watched, one of the branches twitched. Just slightly, barely perceptible, like a finger flexing after a long sleep. "We're leaving," Sarah said, backing away slowly. "Now." Another branch moved, this time more deliberately. Then another. The skulls embedded in the trunk rotated in their sockets, empty eye sockets tracking Sarah's retreat. And from somewhere deep within the bone structure came a sound, a creaking, grinding noise like joints that hadn't moved in centuries trying to remember how. Sarah and Kamani ran. They made it perhaps 50 meters before Sarah realized something was wrong with the landscape. The acacia trees around them looked the same, the grass the same golden brown, but the positions were off. That distinctive rock formation should have been to their left, not their right. The distant copy where they'd left their vehicle should have been visible by now. "We're going in circles," Kamani said, breathing hard. "This is what the stories say happens. The bone tree doesn't let you leave." "That's not possible. We're just disoriented. If we head toward the sun." "The sun is wrong." Sarah looked up. Kamani was right. The sun, which had been rising in the east when they arrived, was now directly overhead despite it being only 7 a.m. by her watch. And the sky around it looked strange, too blue, almost artificially so, like a painted backdrop rather than real atmosphere. They walked for another 20 minutes, heading in what should have been a straight line away from the clearing. But the landscape kept repeating, the same cluster of 3 acacias, the same termite mound, the same pattern of dried stream beds. And each time they passed the landmarks, they seemed slightly different. The acacias a little closer together, the termite mound a little taller, as if they were walking through iterations of the same space, each one diverging further from reality. "We're not in the Serengeti anymore," Sarah said, the words feeling absurd even as she spoke them. "Or we are, but somewhere else, some version of it." Kamani nodded grimly. "The stories say the bone tree stands at the center of a maze. The maze has only one exit back through the clearing, past the tree itself. But to pass it, you must understand what it wants." "What does it want?" "Bones," Kamani's voice was hollow. "It's always been bones. The tree grows by taking them. Animals that wander too close are absorbed. People too. Their bones are added to the structure. The stories say it's been growing since the world was new, that it will keep growing until it reaches the sky." Sarah's scientific mind rebelled against this explanation, but her eyes couldn't deny what they'd seen. The bone tree moving, the landscape looping, the sun in the wrong position. Something was happening here that existed outside normal physical laws. "Then we go back," she said. "We face it, find a way past it." "Many have tried. The elders say the clearing is littered with skulls of those who attempted to pass." "Do we have a choice?" They didn't. They both knew it. The walk back to the clearing took hours, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed as distorted as space in this place. But eventually, they found themselves at the edge of that bone-white circle, staring at the bone tree. It had changed, grown. New bones had been added to its structure, forming intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometry that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space. And it was aware. Sarah could feel its attention on her, ancient and patient and absolutely inhuman. The tree wasn't alive in any biological sense, but it was conscious. Had been conscious for a very, very long time. "What do you want?" Sarah called out, feeling foolish but needing to try. "Why trap us here?" The tree didn't answer, but one of its branches bent downward, pointing at the ground where the human skull lay. As Sarah watched, other branches moved, arranging themselves in patterns, some pointing to skulls embedded in the trunk, others gesturing at the bone-white earth. It was trying to communicate. Sarah moved closer, studying the patterns the branches formed. She'd studied behavioral biology, animal communication, but this was something different. The tree was showing her something, its history perhaps, or its purpose. The branches pointed to the oldest skulls first, specimens so ancient they were almost fossilized, then to newer ones, then to the fresh human skull. A timeline, a record, each skull representing a moment, a life, a death. "You're marking time," Sarah breathed. "You're a record, a monument." The branches shifted, and Sarah got the impression of affirmation. The bone tree wasn't just collecting bones randomly, it was preserving them. Each skeleton added to its structure was a specimen, a date, a point, evidence that a particular species had existed at a particular time. But why? Sarah asked. What's the purpose? The answer came not in words, but in images, visions that flooded Sarah's mind with overwhelming clarity. She saw the Serengeti as it had been millions of years ago, populated by creatures that had no names because they'd gone extinct before humans existed to name them. She saw massive herbivores unlike any elephant or giraffe, saw predators that made lions look like house cats, saw ecosystems rise and fall in geological time-lapse. And in the center of every vision, the bone tree stood, growing slowly, adding bones from each epoch, each era, each age. A living fossil record. A museum built by something that understood time not in years or centuries, but in epochs and eras. You're not from Earth, Sarah said, understanding crystallizing. Or you are, but from so far back that Earth itself was different. You're studying us, studying evolution, collecting specimens. The branches shifted again, affirmation mixed with something else. Sadness, loneliness. It was hard to read emotion from a structure made of bones, but Sarah felt it nonetheless. The tree had been here for millions of years, watching species emerge and go extinct, recording everything, preserving evidence of life that would otherwise vanish completely. But something had changed. The tree's consciousness touched Sarah's mind again, showing her new visions. Recent visions, the Serengeti burning, grasslands becoming desert, animals fleeing or dying, the Great Migration dwindling, then stopping, the ecosystem collapsing under pressure from climate change, habitat loss, human encroachment. The bone tree was afraid, not for itself. It had survived countless extinctions, would survive countless more, but for its collection. For the record it was compiling. Millions of years of data could be lost if the Serengeti ecosystem collapsed completely. Species would vanish without leaving any trace in its structure. That's why you've trapped us, Sarah said. You need specimens. You need to complete your record before it's too late. The branches arranged themselves in a new pattern. A question. Would Sarah volunteer? Would she let her bones be added to the tree, preserved forever as evidence that Homo sapiens had existed, had walked this grassland, had been part of this ecosystem? No, Kamani said firmly, stepping forward. Dr. Mitchell, don't listen to it. This thing has killed thousands. You can see the evidence in its very structure. We need to find another way out. But Sarah was thinking of her research. 6 years studying predator-prey dynamics. 6 years documenting the Serengeti's ecology. 6 years of data about a system that might not exist in another 100 years. What was her work worth if the ecosystem she studied vanished? What good were papers and photographs and population models if there were no lions left to study, no wildebeest left to count? The bone tree could preserve something. Not life. It couldn't stop the extinctions, couldn't reverse climate change or habitat loss, but it could preserve evidence. Could ensure that even after the Serengeti was gone, even after humanity itself was gone, there would be a record that this place had existed, that these animals had lived. If I agree, Sarah said slowly, what happens to him? She nodded at Kamani. Does he go free? The branches shifted affirmation. Dr. Mitchell, no, Kamani protested. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. There is no other way. You said it yourself. The only exit is through the clearing, past the tree, and the tree wants payment. Sarah looked at the structure with new understanding. It's not evil. It's not killing for pleasure. It's doing the same thing I've been doing, recording data, preserving evidence. It's just working on a much longer timescale. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't it? Sarah thought of all the animals she'd tagged for her research, the radio collars and ear notches and tracking devices. She justified those intrusions as necessary for science, for understanding, for preservation. How was the bone tree different? It was trying to preserve something too, trying to save evidence of life from the erasure of extinction. Go, Sarah told Kamani. Tell them you found me dead. Tell them I was killed by a lion, a snake, anything. But don't tell them about this place. Don't let others come looking. The tree needs to remain hidden or your people would destroy it, and with it, millions of years of irreplaceable data. Dr. Mitchell, Sarah. Go, she pushed him toward the edge of the clearing. Before it changes its mind, before. Pain exploded through her leg. Sarah looked down to see a branch wrapped around her ankle, bone-white and impossibly strong. It pulled, dragging her toward the trunk, and she didn't resist. Couldn't resist. The tree's consciousness was in her mind now, showing her what would happen, not the physical process, which she didn't want to think about, but the after. The preservation, the eternal record. She would become part of the collection. Her skeleton would be arranged in the tree's structure, labeled and categorized and preserved alongside thousands of other specimens. And when the Serengeti finally died, when the last lion fell and the last zebra was poached and the grasslands turned to dust, the bone tree would remain, would endure, would carry forward the evidence that this place had mattered, had been home to one of Earth's great ecosystems. It was a kind of immortality. Not the kind she'd imagined when she'd started her research career, but immortality nonetheless. Kamani was running now, fleeing the clearing as the landscape released its hold on him. He would make it back, would return to his village with a story no one would believe. And that was good. The bone tree needed to remain hidden, needed to continue its work undisturbed. Sarah felt her body changing as the branches pulled her closer. Felt her flesh dissolving, her bones separating, each piece being carefully sorted and evaluated. It should have been agonizing, but the tree was merciful. It flooded her nervous system with chemicals that dulled the pain, that brought a strange euphoria. Her vision was fading, but not into darkness, into light, into clarity. She could see through the tree's senses now, could perceive time as it perceived time, epochs stacked like layers in sedimentary rock, species rising and falling like waves. She could see the Serengeti's past stretching back millions of years. Could see its future too, though that future was darker, shorter, ending in silence and dust. But the bone tree would survive, would outlast the ecosystem it documented, would stand alone in a desert that had once been grassland, a monument to what had been lost, evidence for whatever came after that life had existed here, had thrived here, had mattered. Sarah's consciousness expanded, merging with the tree's vast awareness. She could feel every bone in its structure now, could sense the story each one told. The saber-toothed cat that had prowled these plains 3 million years ago, the proto-elephant that had evolved into modern elephants, the ancestor of modern zebras, smaller and less striped. And now, added to the collection, one human female, age 34, researcher, who had spent her life trying to understand and preserve the Serengeti. It was fitting, somehow. She had studied the ecosystem. Now she would be part of its permanent record. The last thing Sarah saw with human eyes was Kamani reaching the edge of the clearing, crossing back into the normal Serengeti, into a world where the sun was in the right position, and time flowed forward at the proper rate. He looked back once, his face anguished, then ran. Good, Sarah thought. Let him live. Let him carry the memory. Then she was gone, her bones sorted and arranged in the tree's growing structure, her consciousness absorbed into its vast, patient awareness. She could still think, still observe, but from a perspective that transcended individual identity. She was Sarah Mitchell, but she was also the bone tree, and she was also every specimen in its collection, a composite consciousness stretching across millions of years. Time passed, days, years, it was hard to tell from inside the tree. The sun rose and set in accelerated cycles. The seasons changed, wet season, dry season, wet season again. Animals passed near the clearing but never entered it, instinct warning them away from the bone-white circle. Occasionally, humans came close. Researchers like Sarah had been, or tourists, or Maasai herders. The tree watched them pass, content to observe. It didn't need more specimens yet. Its collection was growing slowly, sustainably, taking only what it needed when it needed. But Sarah could feel its concern mounting. The Serengeti was changing faster now. Rainfall patterns shifting, temperatures rising, the Great Migration growing smaller each year. Species that had existed here for millennia were vanishing, leaving no trace except their bones and the tree's structure. The tree was running out of time. Its collection was incomplete. There were species it hadn't yet cataloged, subspecies it hadn't preserved, genetic variations it hadn't recorded. And if the ecosystem collapsed before it finished its work, that knowledge would be lost forever. Sarah, from her position within the tree's consciousness, understood its dilemma. It couldn't preserve the living ecosystem, couldn't stop the climate change, couldn't prevent the habitat loss, couldn't reverse the human impacts. But it could preserve evidence, could ensure that even after the Serengeti was gone, its story would remain, told in bones and preserved in the structure of an entity that would outlast civilizations. More time passed. The tree grew slowly, adding specimens as they became available. An old lion who died naturally near the clearing, a zebra struck by lightning, a python killed by a mongoose. Each death was incorporated respectfully, each skeleton arranged with care in the growing structure. And through it all, Sarah watched, observed, recorded. She had become what she'd always been, a researcher, a documenter of life, but on a scale she'd never imagined. She was part of a project that would span millions of years, that would outlast her species, that would carry forward evidence of Earth's biological richness long after that richness had been extinguished. It was not the immortality she'd expected, but it was immortality nonetheless. The bone tree stood in its clearing, white against the golden grass, growing slowly under the African sun. To any observer, it was just another strange natural formation, a curiosity to be photographed and forgotten. But within its structure, consciousness persisted. Sarah's consciousness merged with something far older and stranger, watching the Serengeti cycle through its seasons, recording everything, preserving evidence. The great scientific project continued, and would continue for as long as the tree stood. Which, Sarah understood with the clarity of geological time, would be far, far longer than any human institution. She had wanted to preserve knowledge of the Serengeti's ecology. She had succeeded, just not in the way she'd expected. The bone tree grew. The monument to grief. Priya Sharma had restored dozens of historical monuments across India, but the Taj Mahal was different. Standing in the conservation laboratory adjacent to the main structure at 2:47 a.m., examining a fragment of inlaid marble under magnification, she finally understood why the previous restoration specialist had quit without explanation 3 months ago. The marble was weeping. Not condensation from temperature differential, not moisture seeping through microfractures. The stone was producing tears, actual saline solution with the exact chemical composition of human tears, emerging from the white marble like blood from a wound. Dr. Sharma, Vikram, her assistant, stood in the doorway with 2 cups of chai. "You should rest. We've been working for 16 hours. Priya gestured him over without taking her eyes from the microscope. "Look at this. Tell me what you see." Vikram bent to the eyepiece, was silent for a moment, then straightened slowly. "That's not possible. Marble doesn't produce organic compounds. It's calcium carbonate, a mineral. It can't." "I know what it can't do, but look at it. That's tear fluid. I've run 3 separate chemical analyses. Sodium chloride, proteins, glucose, urea, everything you'd find in human tears." They stared at each other across the laboratory bench, the implications hanging between them unspoken. The Taj Mahal was built as a monument to grief, Emperor Shah Jahan's tribute to his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth in 1631. 22 years of construction, 20,000 workers, materials gathered from across Asia, all to create the most beautiful tomb ever conceived. But what if the grief hadn't stayed metaphorical? What if 3 centuries of visitors mourning their own dead, projecting their own sorrows onto the white marble, had somehow saturated the structure with genuine emotion? What if the Taj Mahal had absorbed so much grief that it had become grief, transformed from monument into something else entirely? "We should report this," Vikram said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The archaeological survey needs to know." "And tell them what? That the monument is crying. They'll think we've been breathing too many chemical fumes." Priya removed the marble sample from the microscope stage, held it up to the light. The fragment was no larger than her palm, white with delicate floral inlays of semi-precious stones, carnelian, jade, lapis lazuli, standard Mughal Payatra Dura work, except for the tears, of course. "The previous specialist," Vikram said quietly, Dr. Kapoor, he sent me an email before he left. I didn't understand it at the time, thought he was having a breakdown. But now, what did it say? He said the building was alive, that it was aware, that at night he could hear it breathing, could feel its grief pressing against his mind like a physical weight. He said the Taj Mahal wasn't mourning Mumtaz Mahal anymore. It was mourning everyone. Every person who'd ever died, every love that had ever ended, every loss that had ever been suffered. He said the grief was infinite and it wanted to share itself. Priya set down the sample carefully. That's absurd. He was obviously having psychological difficulties. The stress of restoration work, being away from family. A sound interrupted her, faint but distinct, echoing through the conservation lab from the main structure beyond. A voice, female, singing. Not the chants of late-night worshippers or the calls of guards making their rounds. This was different. A voice of ethereal beauty, singing in Persian, the words achingly sad despite Priya not understanding the language. "What is that?" Vikram whispered. Priya was already moving toward the door, toward the passageway that connected the lab to the main mausoleum. Professional curiosity overrode caution. Someone was in the monument after hours, violating every security protocol. She needed to report it, needed to. The passageway was wrong. It should have been a simple corridor, concrete and fluorescent lighting, connecting the modern lab to the 17th century structure. But the walls had changed. White marble replaced concrete, geometric Islamic patterns replacing bare utility. Oil lamps flickered where fluorescent tubes should have been, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. "Dr. Sharma, we should go back," Vikram said, his hand on her arm. "This isn't right. The corridor doesn't look like this. It's never looked like this." But Priya was drawn forward by the singing, by the beauty and sorrow in that voice. She'd spent months studying the Taj Mahal's history, knew every detail of Shah Jahan's devotion to Mumtaz, knew how her death had devastated him so completely that he'd spent the rest of his life, 8 years of it imprisoned by his own son, gazing across the Yamuna River at the monument he'd built. Such grief should have been unbearable, should have killed him. What if it hadn't killed him because he'd put it somewhere else? What if he'd poured all that devastating sorrow into the structure itself, embedded it in every stone and tile and inlay, making the Taj Mahal not just a symbol of grief but a container for it? The corridor opened into the main chamber. Priya had been in this room hundreds of times during her restoration work. She knew it intimately. The octagonal chamber 24 meters across, the dome rising 35 meters overhead, the cenotaphs of Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan in the center. Except the emperor wasn't supposed to be here. His tomb was an addition, a deviation from the original plan, added only because his son imprisoned him before he could build his own black marble mausoleum across the river. But the chamber was different now. The cenotaphs glowed with internal light, the marble translucent like alabaster, the inlaid precious stones pulsing with colors too vivid to be natural. The walls were covered in calligraphy Priya had never seen before, not the Quranic verses that decorated the actual monument, but new text, appearing and disappearing like breath on cold glass. And standing before Mumtaz Mahal's tomb was a woman. She wore Mughal court dress, her sari elaborately embroidered, jewelry glittering at her wrists and throat. Her back was to Priya, long black hair falling nearly to her waist, and she was singing, that same heartbreaking Persian song, words about love and loss and separation that transcended language barriers. "Mumtaz Mahal," Priya breathed. The woman turned. Her face was beautiful, the kind of beauty that had inspired an emperor to build the world's most magnificent tomb, but wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent like the marble around them. Her eyes were black voids, deeper than eyes should be, containing something vast and terrible. And when she smiled, Priya saw that her teeth were made of semi-precious stones, carnelian, jade, lapis lazuli. The same materials, inlaid in the monument's walls. "Not Mumtaz," the woman said in Hindi, "but also her, I am what remains, what was poured into stone when flesh failed, the grief given form." Priya wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Beside her, Vikram made a strangled sound of pure terror. "You've been studying me," the woman continued, gliding forward without seeming to walk, her feet not quite touching the marble floor. "Taking samples, analyzing, trying to understand how a building could feel emotion. But you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how, it's why." "Why?" Priya managed. "Because grief needs to go somewhere." The woman gestured at the chamber around them. "Shah Jahan couldn't carry it alone. It would have destroyed him. So he built this place, this perfect monument, and he put his grief into every stone. Fed it into the marble with every tear he shed during construction. The artisans felt it too, the overwhelming sorrow that permeated this place. Many of them wept while they worked, though they couldn't say why. Their tears soaked into the stone alongside the emperor's." The woman paused before one of the walls, placed a translucent hand against the marble. Where she touched, the stone rippled like water, geometric patterns flowing and rearranging. And then the visitors came, thousands of them, tens of thousands, millions across the centuries. They came to see the monument to love, and they brought their own grief with them. Grief for lost spouses, lost children, lost loves. They projected their sorrow onto the white marble, and the marble absorbed it. Year after year, century after century, accumulating grief like sediment accumulating in a river delta. "That's not possible," Priya said, though her voice shook. "Emotion can't be stored in stone, can't become whatever you are." "Can't it?" The woman's smile widened, revealing more of those impossible gemstone teeth. "Matter and energy are interchangeable. Consciousness is electrical patterns in neurons. Why couldn't emotion, given enough intensity and time, imprint itself on matter? Why couldn't grief, concentrated enough, achieve a kind of consciousness?" She moved closer, and Priya felt it, the weight of sorrow pressing against her mind like a physical force. Every loss she'd ever experienced came flooding back. Her grandmother's death when she was 12. Her broken engagement 3 years ago. The miscarriage she'd never told anyone about. Small griefs and large ones, all surfacing simultaneously, threatening to drown her. "You feel it now," the woman said softly. "Just a fraction of what's stored here. The Taj Mahal contains 3.5 centuries of accumulated sorrow. Every person who ever wept at Mumtaz's tomb. Every lover who ever mourned here. Every parent who lost a child and came seeking solace. All of it absorbed, concentrated, preserved in marble." Vikram fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by emotions that weren't entirely his own. Priya fought against it, her training in analytical thinking providing a fragile shield against the onslaught. "What do you want?" she asked. "Want?" The woman laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "I don't want anything, I am grief. Grief doesn't want, it simply is. But I do need something. The monument is failing. You've seen it in your restoration work. Cracks in the marble, discoloration from pollution, structural weaknesses. The physical structure is deteriorating. That's why we're here, to preserve it, to repair." "You can't repair what's wrong. The problem isn't the stone. It's what the stone contains. 3 centuries of grief is too much. The marble is saturated. It can't hold anymore. And when it fails, when the structure finally crumbles, all that accumulated sorrow will be released at once." Priya's mind raced through the implications. How much grief are we talking about? What would happen if? Imagine every person in Agra simultaneously experiencing the worst loss of their lives. Then expand that radius. Delhi, Mumbai, eventually the entire subcontinent, perhaps the world. Grief is contagious, Dr. Sharma, it spreads. And this much grief released all at once. The woman shook her head. It would be a pandemic of sorrow. Suicide rates would skyrocket. Violence would erupt as people lashed out in pain. Society would collapse under the weight of so much accumulated suffering. "You're lying, trying to manipulate us. This is." The woman touched Priya's forehead with one translucent finger. Reality shattered. Priya saw the Taj Mahal as it truly was. Not the pristine monument tourists photographed, but a structure screaming in silent agony. Every molecule saturated with sorrow, cracks spreading not from physical stress, but from emotional overload. She saw the future the woman had described. Cities consumed by inexplicable grief, millions weeping without knowing why, society tearing itself apart as 3 centuries of accumulated sorrow spread like radiation from a meltdown. And she saw what the woman wanted, what the grief itself wanted. Release. Not through catastrophic failure, but through controlled dispersal. Through individuals willing to take portions of the grief into themselves, to carry it, to dilute it across many hearts instead of storing it all in one failing structure. The vision ended. Priya staggered backward, gasping. "You want us to absorb it," she said, "to take the grief into ourselves." "Not all of it, that would destroy you, but some. Enough to ease the pressure to buy time for a more permanent solution. You and your assistant, the guards, the other restoration workers, anyone who has spent significant time here. The monument has been leaking grief for months. You've all absorbed traces already. Haven't you noticed? The melancholy that settles over this place after dark, the dreams of loss that plague everyone who works here." Priya thought of her own dreams over the past 3 months. Nightmares of losing everyone she loved, of being abandoned, of dying alone. She'd attributed them to stress, to the demanding nature of the restoration work. But what if they were something else? What if the Taj Mahal had been trying to communicate its need, trying to share its burden? "And if we refuse?" she asked. "Then the structure continues to deteriorate. In 5 years, perhaps 10, it will reach critical saturation. And when it fails..." The woman gestured at the glowing walls, at the calligraphy that appeared and vanished like ghost writing. "All this grief will flood out at once. Better a controlled release than a catastrophic one." Vikram had stopped crying but remained on his knees, staring at nothing. "How?" he asked hoarsely. "How do we take the grief?" "You already know," the woman said. "You've been absorbing it gradually just by being here, by caring about this place. To accelerate the process, you need only consent. Open yourself to the monument's sorrow. Let it flow into you instead of pushing it away. It will hurt. Grief always hurts, but you'll survive. And the monument will survive too, its burden eased, its structure preserved for another generation." Priya looked at the cenotaphs, at the delicate marble screens surrounding them, at the intricate inlay work she'd spent months studying and analyzing. The Taj Mahal was a masterpiece, possibly the greatest architectural achievement in human history. Letting it fail, letting centuries of grief explode across the world, was unthinkable. But taking that grief into herself, carrying sorrow that belonged to millions of strangers, that was asking something she didn't know if she could give. "How much grief would we each need to take?" she asked. "As much as you can bear. There are 43 people currently working on the restoration. If each of you took an equal share, it would be manageable. Difficult, but not impossible. You'd carry additional sorrow for the rest of your lives, a baseline of melancholy, a tendency toward tears, a deeper empathy for others' suffering. But you'd remain functional. The grief wouldn't consume you. Unless we refuse. Then I'll keep looking, keep appearing to those who work here, hoping someone will have the courage to help. Eventually, the structure will fail regardless. But I hope that doesn't happen. I was Mumtaz once, or part of her essence was used to create me. I don't want my monument to die. More than that, I don't want the world to drown in the grief it contains." Priya closed her eyes, thinking of her grandmother's funeral. The overwhelming sorrow she'd felt. The way it had consumed her for months afterward, making everything gray and meaningless. Could she volunteer to feel that again? To carry it permanently, along with the grief of countless others? But if she didn't, millions might feel it, all at once. With no preparation, no understanding, no way to process it. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll take my share." The woman's expression softened, some of the wrongness leaving her features. "Thank you, and your assistant." Vikram looked up at Priya, his face wet with tears, then nodded. "If Dr. Sharma trusts you, if this is really necessary, yes, I'll help." Then kneel before the cenotaph, place your hands on the marble, and open your hearts to the grief within. They did as instructed, kneeling side by side before Mumtaz Mahal's tomb. The marble was warm under Priya's hands, almost body temperature, and she could feel it pulsing like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes and tried to open herself to whatever was stored in the stone. The grief hit like a tsunami. Priya experienced 1,000 losses simultaneously. A mother burying her child, a widower at his wife's funeral, a daughter saying goodbye to a dying father. Each loss was specific, unique, devastating. And they kept coming, wave after wave, an endless ocean of sorrow that threatened to drown her identity entirely. She heard herself screaming but couldn't stop. The grief was too much, too vast, she couldn't hold it, couldn't contain it, it would tear her apart. Then the flow slowed, became manageable. The woman, the grief made manifest, was controlling the transfer, metering it, ensuring Priya took only what she could survive. The sorrow settled into her heart like a stone, heavy but bearable, a permanent weight she'd carry forever. Beside her, Vikram was sobbing, his whole body shaking with the force of the grief flowing into him. But he didn't pull away, didn't break contact with the cenotaph. He held on, accepting his burden, taking his share. Time lost meaning. They might have knelt there for minutes or hours, but eventually the flow stopped. The weight in Priya's chest stabilized. She opened her eyes to find the chamber returning to normal, or what passed for normal in the Taj Mahal at 3 a.m. The walls were white marble again, not glowing. The cenotaphs were solid stone, not translucent. The calligraphy was the familiar Quranic verses, not the ghost writing of accumulated sorrow. The woman was fatting, becoming translucent, her purpose fulfilled. "Thank you," she said, her voice distant. "The monument is grateful, I am grateful. You've bought us time, perhaps a century, perhaps more. Enough for another solution to be found, or for the world to evolve beyond the need for such places." "Will we see you again?" Priya asked. "Perhaps, when the grief accumulates enough again, when another transfer becomes necessary, but not for many years. Rest now, mourn what you've taken on, then live. The grief you carry honors those who felt it originally. Don't let it destroy you." She disappeared completely, leaving Priya and Vikram alone in the chamber. They helped each other stand, both moving carefully, as if the grief they carried had physical weight. In a sense, it did. Priya could feel it in every movement, every breath, a sadness that would never entirely leave, a shadow on her soul that would color every experience going forward. They made their way back through the corridor, which had returned to its mundane concrete reality. The conservation lab looked exactly as they'd left it, the marble samples still on the bench, their cold chai sitting in cups, as if no time had passed at all. "What do we tell people?" Vikram asked. His eyes were red from crying, his face haggard. He looked like someone who'd aged years in a single night. "The truth," Priya said. "Just not all of it. We tell them we found evidence of structural stress in the marble. We recommend additional conservation measures. We continue our work." She picked up the sample that had been weeping tears. It was dry now, the stone inert, just calcium carbonate and inlaid semi-precious gems. "And the grief. We carry it, that's what we agreed to, what we chose." Priya felt the weight in her chest, acknowledged it, accepted it. "We carry it so the monument doesn't have to, so the world doesn't drown in centuries of accumulated sorrow." Over the following weeks, Priya spoke privately with the other restoration workers, the guards, the cleaners, everyone who spent significant time at the Taj Mahal. She didn't tell them about the woman, about the grief made manifest, but she explained the theoretical framework, that monuments to tragedy could absorb emotional resonance, that centuries of mourning visitors could imprint their sorrow on the physical structure, that this accumulated grief might need release. To her surprise, most of them understood immediately. They'd felt it, the weight of sadness that permeated the place after dark, the inexplicable melancholy that settled over anyone who spent too long among the white marble arches. Some had been having the same dreams as Priya, the same nightmares of loss and abandonment. One by one, they agreed to help, agreed to take their share of the grief, to carry it so the monument wouldn't have to. 43 people total. Just as the woman had predicted, each one kneeling before the cenotaph in the deep night, each one opening their hearts to sorrow that didn't belong to them. And the Taj Mahal stabilized. The cracks stopped spreading. The discoloration halted. The marble that had been weeping tears dried. Chemical analysis showed normal mineral composition with no organic compounds. To the outside world, it appeared that the restoration work had been unusually successful, that Dr. Sharma's team had developed innovative techniques for structural preservation. Only those 43 people knew the truth. They became a quiet fellowship bonded by the grief they carried. They met occasionally, not officially but by chance, in the gardens or the museum or the conservation labs. They didn't talk about what they'd done, didn't need to. The weight in their chests was communication enough. They'd look at each other and nod, acknowledgement passing between them. We carry it. We remember. We honor what was given. Priya continued her restoration work, but the nature of it changed. She wasn't just preserving stone and marble anymore. She was tending to grief, managing it, ensuring it didn't accumulate beyond what the structure could hold. She trained new workers carefully, explaining obliquely that emotional awareness was as important as technical skill when working on monuments built from sorrow. And late at night, when the last tourists had left and the moon turned the white marble silver, Priya would sometimes stand in the main chamber and feel the monument breathing. Not with life, exactly, but with something like it. Consciousness born from concentrated emotion, awareness emerging from accumulated sorrow. The Taj Mahal was alive, had been alive for centuries, perhaps since the moment Shah Jahan first poured his devastating grief into the foundation. It was alive with the sorrow of millions, aware with the accumulated mourning of 3.5 centuries of visitors who'd wept at Mumtaz Mahal's tomb. And now, thanks to 43 people willing to carry grief that wasn't theirs, it would continue to live, would continue to stand as the world's most beautiful monument to love and loss, would continue to absorb the sorrow of visitors who came seeking solace, but at a sustainable rate, with human hearts sharing the burden. Priya placed her hand on the marble cenotaph, felt the warmth beneath her palm, the slow pulse that might have been her imagination but probably wasn't. "We'll take care of you," she whispered. "We'll carry what you can't hold alone. That's our purpose now, our duty." The marble pulsed once beneath her hand. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or gratitude. Priya smiled despite the weight in her chest, despite the grief she'd carry for the rest of her life. She'd chosen this. They all had. And it was worth it, to preserve beauty, to prevent catastrophe, to honor the millions who'd mourned here across the centuries. The Taj Mahal would stand. And 43 hearts would ensure it did, carrying sorrow so others wouldn't have to, bearing grief so the monument could continue its purpose, not just as tribute to lost love, but as container for the universal human experience of loss. It was a burden, but it was also a privilege. To carry grief was to acknowledge its importance, to validate the losses of strangers, to say through action that sorrow mattered, that mourning deserved respect, that love lost was still love worth remembering. Priya left the chamber as dawn began to break over the Yamuna River, painting the white marble pink and gold. The Taj Mahal glowed in the early light, beautiful and terrible and alive with accumulated sorrow. A monument to grief. A container for loss. A testimony to love. And now, thanks to those willing to share its burden, a survivor. The structure would endure. And so would the fellowship of 43 souls who'd chosen to carry its impossible weight. Together, the democracy of shadows. Dr. Alina Vasiliou discovered the chamber beneath the Phoenix Hill on the third day of excavation, 42 meters below the ancient speaker's platform where Athenian democracy was born. The ground-penetrating radar had shown an anomaly, a void where there should be solid bedrock, but nothing prepared her for what the excavation revealed. A parliament chamber, complete with stone benches arranged in semicircular rows, a raised platform for speakers, even what appeared to be voting urns. All carved from living rock, perfectly preserved, untouched for what carbon dating would later suggest was nearly 3,000 years. But the architecture wasn't what made Alina's breath catch. It was the shadows. They moved independently of any light source, flowing across the walls like oil on water, congregating in the corners, poolsing with something that resembled breath or heartbeat. And as she watched, one of them detached from the wall and stood, not rising, but simply becoming vertical, a human-shaped absence of light approximately 2 meters tall. Dr. Vasiliou, Demetris, her graduate assistant, appeared at the excavation entrance behind her. The ministry wants an update on what is that. The shadow turned toward them. Alina felt its attention like a physical touch, cold and assessing. Then it spoke, not with sound but directly into her mind, words forming in ancient Greek that she somehow understood perfectly despite her specialization being in classical rather than archaic dialects. Finally, someone who can hear us, someone who can understand. We've been waiting so long. Alina's archaeological training warred with instinct. Every rational part of her mind insisted that shadows couldn't move independently, couldn't speak, couldn't be aware. But she was looking at proof that they could, that they were. "What are you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "We are the disenfranchised, the uncounted, those who had no voice in the democracy your ancestors claimed to invent." The shadow gestured at the chamber around them. "This was built for us, a parliament for those denied participation in the one above, but we were forgotten, buried, left to debate in darkness for 3 millennia. More shadows were manifesting now, dozens of them, filling the stone benches as if settling in for a session. Alina could see variations among them, some taller, some shorter, some with shapes that suggested feminine curves or masculine breadth. Human shapes, all of them, but rendered in pure absence of light. "The Athenian democracy," Alina said slowly, understanding beginning to form. "It wasn't universal. Only adult male citizens could vote. Women, slaves, foreigners, they were excluded. 43,000 citizens had the franchise, * the shadow said. But there were over 300,000 people in Athens. The majority had no voice, no vote, no representation. We were the democracy's shadow, the truth it tried to ignore." Demetrius was backing toward the entrance. "Dr. Vassiliou, we need to leave. We need to seal this chamber and—" "No," Alina's response was immediate, instinctive. "This is the most important archaeological discovery in decades, perhaps centuries. We need to document it, study it, understand it." "Study us?" The shadow's tone, insofar as a voice in her mind could have tone, held dark amusement. "We've been studying you. For 3,000 years, we've watched Athens through the stone, seen how the city evolved, how democracy spread across the world. And we've learned something interesting." The shadows moved, flowing down from their benches to surround Alina and Demetrius. The temperature dropped, breath misting in air that had been warm moments before. "Democracy is a lie," the shadow said. "Every democracy excludes someone, draws boundaries around who counts as the people. In ancient Athens, it was women and slaves. In modern democracies, it's immigrants, prisoners, those too young to vote. There's always an underclass, always a majority denied voice, always shadows beneath the light." "That's changing," Alina protested. "Modern democracies are more inclusive, more representative." "Are they?" The shadow moved closer, and Alina could feel the cold radiating from it like heat from a fire in reverse. "Or have they simply become better at hiding their exclusions? Better at convincing the disenfranchised that their lack of voice is natural, necessary, justified?" The shadows began to chant no sound, but Alina heard it nonetheless, felt it resonating in her bones. Ancient Greek words, a voting formula she recognized from her research. "All in favor. Aye. All opposed. Nay," over and over, the ritual of democratic decision-making, but performed by those who'd never been allowed to participate. And with each repetition, the shadows grew more solid, more real. "What's happening?" Demetrius whispered, pressed against the chamber wall. "Why are they becoming visible?" Alina understood with creeping horror. "They're using us, our awareness of them, our acknowledgement that they exist. We've given them something they haven't had in 3,000 years, witnesses, recognition." "Exactly," the shadow said, and now Alina could see features forming in that darkness. The suggestion of a face, female, young, with eyes that held 3 millennia of patient fury. "We've been waiting for someone to find this chamber, someone to acknowledge what was buried here. Your democracy above was built on our silence, but silence, given enough time, becomes a voice of its own." The chamber began to shake, not an earthquake, something worse. The shadows were spreading, seeping through cracks in the stone, flowing upward toward the surface. Alina could see them rising through solid rock like smoke through screens, ascending toward the modern city above. "Stop," she said. "Whatever you're planning, you need to stop. Athens has millions of people, if we what? Speak our truth. Demand our voice. We've been silent for 3,000 years, Dr. Vassiliou. Don't we deserve our turn?" The shadows were nearly translucent now, barely distinguishable from normal darkness. But Alina could still feel them, could sense their presence spreading through the bedrock beneath Athens, reaching toward every place where democracy was practiced or discussed or celebrated. Toward the modern parliament building, toward the universities where political philosophy was taught, toward every voting station and civic center and place of assembly. "This is about more than Athens," Alina breathed. "You want to spread, to reach every democracy in the world. We want what was always owed to us: participation, voice, recognition that we exist and have always existed, the shadow beneath every system that claims to represent the people while excluding most of them." The lead shadow, the one that had first spoken, moved to stand directly before Alina. Up close, its features were clear. A woman perhaps 20 years old with hair bound in the style of classical Athens, wearing the suggestion of a simple chiton. A slave, perhaps, or a medic, a foreign resident. Someone who would have lived in the democracy's heart but been denied any role in its governance. "You're a woman," the shadow observed. "In ancient Athens, you would have been one of us, voiceless, property of your father or husband. Your intelligence, your education, your expertise, none of it would have mattered. You would have been excluded from democracy by accident of birth." "Things are different now," Alina said, though the argument felt weak even to her. "Different, yes. Better, marginally. But there are still exclusions, still people denied voice, still systems that claim to represent everyone while serving the interests of a few. The forms change. The fundamental lie remains." Demetrius had his phone out, trying to call for help, but the signal was dead. The shadows seemed to absorb all electromagnetic radiation, creating a bubble of isolation around the chamber. "What do you want?" Alina asked. "What would satisfy you? What would make you stop?" The shadow that was a woman tilted her head, considering. Around them, the other shadows had paused in their ascent, waiting for her response. "Tell our story," she said finally. "Acknowledge what was buried here. Make people understand that their democracy has always cast shadows, has always excluded voices, has always been incomplete. And then," she paused, and Alina sensed something shifting in the darkness, a decision being made. "Then let us vote." "Vote on what?" "On whether to continue. Whether democracy, flawed and exclusive as it's always been, is still worth preserving. Or whether it should be ended entirely, replaced with something else. Something that might not even have a name yet." The implications made Alina's head spin. You want the disenfranchised of history, 3,000 years of voiceless people, to vote on the future of democracy itself. Is that not appropriate? The excluded finally getting to decide whether the system that excluded them deserves to exist. The shadows voting on whether the light should continue to shine. That's insane. You can't just end democracy. Billions of people depend on it, live under it, believe in it. "As they should have a voice in this decision too," the shadow interrupted. "We're not autocrats, Dr. Vassiliou. We're not interested in replacing one tyranny with another. We simply want what was always denied us: participation. Let everyone vote. The living and the shadows. The franchised and the disenfranchised. All voices heard for once. True democracy, not the limited version your ancestors practiced." Alina's mind raced through the logistics, the impossibilities. How would that even work? You're talking about counting votes from people who have been dead for thousands of years. From millions, billions of people excluded from various democracies throughout history. It's not physically possible. "It's not physical," the shadow agreed. "It's something else. A vote that transcends body and time. We are consciousness without flesh, awareness without form. And we've learned in 3,000 years of existence how to reach others like us. Every slave who died without freedom. Every woman denied education. Every immigrant refused citizenship. Every person excluded from the people despite being people themselves. They leave shadows too, echoes, traces in the collective unconscious of humanity. The shadow extended a hand toward Alina, and she saw it was no longer entirely dark. There were colors within it now, muted but present, as if it was drawing substance from her awareness of it. We can call them, summon all the disenfranchised of history to this vote, but we need an anchor, a living person who understands what's at stake, who can stand between the light and shadow, who can hold the space for true democratic participation. Will you be that anchor, Dr. Vasiliou? And if I refuse? Then we'll find someone else, or we'll simply act without anchor, letting chaos decide the outcome. But we thought you might understand. You've spent your career studying democracy, excavating its origins, trying to understand how it worked. Now you can see it complete, not just the system that existed, but the one that should have existed, all voices included. Dimitris grabbed Alina's arm. Dr. Vasiliou, please, don't agree to this. We don't know what they are, what they want, what this vote would actually mean. We should seal the chamber, report to the ministry, let experts. I am an expert, Alina said quietly. And these shadows are right about one thing. Democracy has always been incomplete, has always excluded more people than it included. Maybe it's time we face that truth. Then you'll help us. The shadow's voice held something like hope. Alina thought of her grandmother, who hadn't been allowed to vote until 1952. Of her great-grandmother, who'd lived her entire life without political voice. Of countless women across history, denied participation in systems that claimed to represent them. Of slaves whose labor built democracies they could never join. Of immigrants who contributed to societies that refused them citizenship. I'll help you call the vote, she said, but I can't control the outcome. If the shadows decide democracy should end, then it ends. That's what democracy means, doesn't it? The people decide, not some people, not a carefully selected subset, everyone. The shadow placed its hand over Alina's heart, and she gasped at the sensation. Not cold, as she'd expected, but something else. A connection forming, her consciousness expanding to encompass something vast and ancient and hungry for voice. She could feel them now. The shadows. Not just those in the chamber, but those sleeping in the bedrock of every city where democracy had ever been practiced. Athens, Rome, Florence, Philadelphia, Paris, London, Mumbai, Tokyo, Johannesburg. Everywhere humans had gathered to govern themselves while excluding portions of themselves. The shadows had been there, watching, waiting, accumulating like sediment in the cracks of history. And now, anchored through Alina, they began to wake. The vote began at midnight. Not official midnight, but the metaphysical witching hour when boundaries thin between past and present, light and shadow, living and dead. Alina sat in the ancient chamber, surrounded by darkness that pressed against her skin like water, and felt herself becoming the conduit for something unprecedented in human history. The shadows of Athens came first. 3,000 years of the disenfranchised, flowing through the stone, through Alina, manifesting in the chamber as barely visible presences. Women who'd watched their husbands vote while they remained silent. Slaves who'd built the Parthenon without any say in the democracy it symbolized. Medics who'd contributed to Athenian culture and economy while being denied citizenship. They filled the stone benches, thousands of them, more than the chamber could physically hold, but holding them nonetheless because this wasn't entirely physical anymore. Alina could feel their presence, their awareness, their hunger for participation that had been denied for so long. And then the vote spread. Like a wave propagating from a point source, it reached outward from Athens to every place where democracy had excluded people. Alina felt it moving through her, through the connection the shadow had established, reaching across time and space to touch other shadows in other cities. She saw Rome, where plebeians had fought for representation while others remained excluded. Saw revolutionary France, where liberty, equality, fraternity hadn't extended to women or colonies. Saw America, where all men created equal had been interpreted narrowly, excluding women, slaves, Native Americans, anyone who didn't fit the founders' definition of personhood. The shadows woke everywhere, and through Alina, they began to vote. Not with ballots or show of hands, but with something more fundamental, pure expression of will, consciousness declaring its position on whether democracy deserved to continue. Each shadow made its choice, and Alina felt the weight of their decisions accumulating, building toward a result that would determine the future of human governance. Demetrius sat against the chamber wall, watching with wide eyes as his mentor became something other than human, a vessel for historical grievance, a channel for the voiceless to finally speak. He'd called the ministry hours ago, or tried to, but phones didn't work near the chamber anymore. The shadows absorbed all signals, all communication. This vote would happen in isolation, and the world wouldn't know until it was too late to intervene. Hours passed, or days. Time moved strangely in the chamber, bending around the weight of so many accumulated consciousnesses pressing against reality. Alina sat at the center of it, feeling every vote, every shadow's decision, every 3,000-year-old grievance given voice. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The shadows were voting, but not the way Alina had expected. They weren't choosing to end democracy or preserve it. They were choosing something more complex: evolution, change. A transformation of democracy into something that actually lived up to its name: rule by the people, all the people. Without exclusion, without hierarchy, without the careful boundaries that defined who counted as human enough to participate. "You see now," the female shadow said, her voice clearer now, more solid. "We don't want to destroy, we want to complete. Democracy was always meant to include us. Its architects just lacked the courage to follow their principles to logical conclusion." "But how?" Alina asked, her own voice hoarse from disuse. "How do you include the dead in governance of the living? How do you give voice to shadows?" "The same way you've always given voice to the past, through memory, through acknowledgement, through letting history inform present decisions. We're not asking to vote on your taxes or your wars. We're asking that when you make democratic decisions, you remember us. Consider what we would say. Let the shadow inform the light instead of pretending we don't exist." The vote was reaching its conclusion. Alina could feel it, a decision crystallizing from thousands of individual choices, a consensus emerging from ancient grievance. The shadows had made their choice. Democracy would continue, but it would be haunted. Every democratic assembly from this day forward would have to acknowledge the shadows in the room, the excluded, the voiceless, the ones whose labor and lives built the system they couldn't join. Not as obstacles or complications, but as full participants, their perspectives weighed, their voices heard through those who remembered them. "We're giving you a gift," the shadow said. "The gift of complete vision. The ability to see your democracy as it truly is, not a shining ideal, but a flawed system built on exclusion, sustained by forgetting, defended by people who benefited from others' voicelessness." "And in return," Alina asked, "what do you get?" "Recognition, remembrance, the knowledge that we're finally part of the conversation, even if only as memory and conscience. It's not full participation, but it's more than we've ever had." The chamber began to brighten, not with light exactly, but with a lessening of darkness. The shadows were fading, their vote cast, their purpose fulfilled. But Alina could still feel them, still sense their presence in the stone around her, in the bedrock beneath Athens, in the foundations of every place where democracy had ever been practiced. They weren't gone. They were woven into the structure now, permanent residents of a system that had tried to exclude them. Democracy's shadow made manifest, undeniable, eternal. "You'll tell our story," the shadow said. It was a statement, not a question. "You'll make sure people understand what was found here, what voted here, what became part of democracy on this night." "I will," Alina promised, "though I don't know if anyone will believe me." "They'll believe, because from now on, every democracy will feel us. Every vote will carry the weight of our presence. Every assembly will sense the shadows in the room. We're part of the system now, a permanent reminder of who was excluded, who was silenced, who was forgotten." The female shadow was almost transparent now, fading into normal darkness. But before she vanished completely, she smiled. Alina could see it clearly, an expression of satisfaction and sorrow mixed together. "Thank you," she said. "For 3,000 years, we've waited for someone to hear us, to acknowledge we exist. to let us participate even in this limited way. You've given us voice. That's all we ever wanted." Then she was gone. They were all gone. The chamber was just a chamber again, ancient stone and carved benches, archaeological find of tremendous significance but no longer supernaturally occupied. Except Alina could still feel them. In the back of her mind, a constant presence, voices that weren't quite voices, shadows that cast no darkness but were there nonetheless. The disenfranchised of history, taking their place in democracy not as participants but as conscience, not as voters but as witnesses. "Dr. Vasiliou," Dimitris approached carefully. "Is it over?" "No," Alina said, standing on legs that barely supported her. "It's beginning. We need to report this. Need to make people understand what happened here tonight." They'll never believe it. Shadow people voting on the future of democracy. Ancient consciousnesses reaching across time. It sounds insane. "Maybe, but I'll document it anyway. Publish it. Let academics debate whether I've lost my mind. Because those shadows are right about one thing: democracy has always been incomplete. And now we can't pretend otherwise. We have to acknowledge the exclusions, the silences, the voices that were never heard." They climbed out of the chamber, up through 42 meters of excavation, emerging into Athenian dawn. The city spread before them, modern buildings rising among ancient ruins, democracy's birthplace now home to millions who'd never vote in the assembly where it all began. But something was different. Alina could see it: shadows that moved independently in doorways, darkness that pooled in corners with too much awareness, presence in every place where people gathered to make decisions. The vote had changed something fundamental. The shadows were no longer hidden. They were visible to anyone who knew to look, to anyone willing to acknowledge that democracy had always excluded more people than it included. Over the following weeks, Alina documented everything. Published papers that were dismissed as academic fantasy or evidence of mental breakdown. Spoke at conferences where colleagues nodded politely before changing the subject. Wrote a book that sold poorly and was reviewed harshly. But she also noticed something else. People were starting to see the shadows. Not everyone, not all at once, but gradually. A politician giving a speech would pause, distracted by movement at the edge of her vision. A voter entering a polling station would feel watched by something that cast no reflection. An assembly would fall suddenly silent, everyone sensing a presence they couldn't quite explain. The shadows were keeping their promise. They were there in every democratic space, reminding the living that they'd inherited a flawed system, that their voice rested on the silence of countless others, that democracy had always been incomplete. And some people listened. Reforms began small at first, tentative. Expansions of voting rights, lowering of barriers to participation, acknowledgement of historical exclusions. Not enough, never enough, but movement in the right direction. The shadows were patient. They'd waited 3,000 years. They could wait longer. Alina returned to the chamber frequently, descending into that ancient parliament, sitting among the stone benches. Sometimes she could hear them, faint whispers in Greek and Latin and languages that had no names, the discussions of the disenfranchised continuing their eternal debate. What should democracy be? Who should it include? How could a system that claimed to represent everyone actually fulfill that promise? The questions had no easy answers, perhaps had no answers at all, but they were being asked now by voices that had been silent for millennia, by shadows that refused to remain hidden. And that, Alina thought, was a kind of democracy too. Not the neat, bounded system the ancient Athenians had invented, but something messier, more inclusive, more honest about its limitations and failures. Democracy haunted by its own history, unable to forget who it had excluded, forced to acknowledge the shadows it cast. One evening, 6 months after the discovery, Alina sat in the chamber and spoke aloud. "Are you satisfied? Is this what you wanted?" The shadows stirred, and she heard the female voice again, faint but present. "It's a beginning. Democracy was always meant to evolve. Your ancestors invented it, we're helping perfect it. The work continues. The conversation goes on. That's all we can ask. Will you always be here, always watching? Always, we're part of the structure now. woven into the foundations of every democracy, built into the concept itself. When people say democracy, they'll feel us, the excluded, the voiceless, the forgotten. We're the conscience of the system, the reminder that it's never been complete and perhaps never will be. Is that enough? It has to be. We can't vote on your laws, can't participate directly, but we can watch. We can remind. We can be the shadow that makes you question whether your light shines on everyone or just those you've deemed worthy of illumination. Alina nodded, understanding. The shadows weren't asking for power. They were asking for acknowledgement, for their existence and exclusion to be remembered, factored into decisions, considered when people claimed to govern in the name of the people. It was both more and less than full participation, but it was something, and it was more than they'd had for 3,000 years. She left the chamber as night fell over Athens, walking through streets where shadows moved with too much awareness, where darkness held memory and conscience. The city had always been haunted by its history, its glories, its failures. Now that haunting was visible, undeniable, permanent. Democracy's shadow had found its voice, and it would never be silent again. The Phoenix Hill rose above the city, its ancient speakers' platform still visible where Athenian democracy had been born. And beneath it, 42 meters down in living rock, the Parliament of Shadows continued its eternal session, debating, discussing, voting on questions that had no clear answers. What is democracy? Who should participate? How can we include everyone? The conversations echoed through the stone, up through the bedrock, spreading across Athens and beyond. And everywhere they reached, people paused, felt something shift, became aware of voices they'd been trained to ignore. The excluded were speaking. The shadows had voted. And democracy would never be the same.